Today we are here with Professor Geoffrey Benjamin of Nanyang Technological University, a specialist on the Orang Asli, or Aboriginal languages and cultures of the people of the Malaysian Peninsula. He's been doing this sort of work for 50 years, and today we're interviewing him to see how he got into this field and what he sees as the prospects for the field. Professor Benjamin?
The initial connection with Malaysia was quite fortuitous and really rather trivial. I switched from a first degree in biology to finish off the necessary number of years at Cambridge, where I was studying, by doing social anthropology. And a student expedition of the traditional kind was advertised for the coming long vacation by a Malaysian student studying at Cambridge to go and work or visit the Temeas for a short trip. I indicated willingness to do that. In the end, that expedition fell through, came to nothing, but my supervisor, Edmund Leech, had already, in fact, been interested himself at some time to study the Temeas, on whom an initial publication had appeared in the 1930s by someone who subsequently died. So he thought it would make a good topic for PhD, because after 2 years of studying social anthropology, I wanted to go on and do a PhD in the subject. You can't do that these days straight from BA to PhD, but it was encouraged, and that's how I ended up with an interest in Temeas, even though I'd never been to Southeast Asia before.
But once you came, you liked it here and stayed?
I liked it. Well, I did the 18 or 19 months field work on the Temeas. This was 1964-65. Still remote in both senses. To get to this part of the world, I had to travel by sea, not by air, and of course I was working in the remotest part of the Malay Peninsula, and I was even supplied by monthly parachute airdrops. So it was remote. I went back to Cambridge to write the PhD thesis. And then a job was advertised at the old University of Singapore in Bukit Timah, which had just started a sociology department, and apart from the first professor to head that department, I was the first full-time appointment there. That was late 1967.
Okay.
And so that's how I ended up here. And apart from 6 fruitful years that I spent later at ANU in Canberra, I came back here and have been at NUS and NTU
Right.
in various capacities since.
And continue working on language, not just in Temur, but on other languages in
Right.
the area.
As regards language, particular languages, I've had 2 interests, but Temur itself, its grammar, vocabulary, and so on, but also in the early 70s, I did an initial lexicostatistical classification of the Aslian languages as they came to be known, that's to say the Austroasiatic languages of the Malay Peninsula, and that stood the test of time pretty well. Others have investigated it again since, both by statistical and by reconstruction methods, and the classification has basically stood. But I also became interested in Malay, unrelated of course to Temur and the Aslian languages. Initially I used very bad Malay, which I'd learned from a not very advanced textbook as my contact language, but I got interested in Malay itself, and I've since published 2 quite detailed papers on various aspects of Malay as well as the Aslian languages.
Particular varieties of Malay?
With attention to the way in which it contains many varieties, some highly abbreviated, some very elaborate, and of course cross-nationally, since it's language, it has standardized varieties spoken in several Southeast Asian countries.
One of the things that's interesting about you, for me at least, is the fact that you don't really separate disciplines, that you're training maybe social anthropology, but you're doing sociology, doing linguistics, you're doing many different things. And could you maybe talk about your approach to things? I mean, your dissertation was on religion, right?
Right.
Your religion.
Since in recent years it's been published as the central chapters of my book on Temia religion, which contains a lot of later stuff as well. The social anthropology as taught when I was an undergraduate was really quite sociological. The same basic theoretical framework was used. It's basically Durkheim, Weber, not really Marx at that stage. Same theoretical framework as sociologists would use, although there was no sociology at Cambridge in those days. Sociology was really buried in social anthropology. Linguistics was an option within the social anthropology degree, and I chose to do it, and luckily I had John Lyons, who later became very distinguished, and I had him once a week. I had to write him one essay every week. Wow. Just me and John Lyons, no other student present. So it was a pretty rigorous sort of training, and it was at the time when Chomsky was just coming in, with Lyons as one of the commentators, if you like, on Chomsky. As regards disciplines, I regard disciplines as useful for teaching, but frankly not really for research. I mean, that's what I like about anthropology. It's inherently a subject which stretches across any borders that disciplines might want to.
In the Boasian sense, you know,
yes, sure. Boas, Malinowski, those kinds of founding fathers, they stretched across these borders. In fact,
Malinowski did.
As it happens, 4 or 5 of my teachers at Cambridge were themselves students of Malinowski.
Oh, so, really? That explains a lot. And I also, I mean, it was Malinowski's influence was in linguistics, and through Firth and others. So there was quite a bit of influence all around.
Yeah, actually, I recently reread Malinowski's own linguistic papers on Kiruina language. Very impressive studies, actually.
Right. Yeah. Could you go back to your time at Cambridge and studying with Geoffrey Leech and also
Edmund Leech.
Edmund Leech, I'm sorry. Edmund Leech and Jack Goody, and how these people kind of influenced you?
Leech's influence was fairly obvious, and of course he's a Southeast Asian specialist, so that's what pushed me into this area, geographically speaking. He did run an area course on South and Southeast Asia. He didn't want to teach it. Only 2 of us signed up for it, but he in the end did teach it, and it included South Asia too, which in effect meant some material on India and Sri Lanka as well. Very different kind of course than what I later was teaching as an area course on Southeast Asia. The first anthropologist I ever spoke to, however, was Maya Fortis, who was the professor of anthropology and happened to be a fellow of my college, and he encouraged me, amongst other things, when I said I may not have funds to complete the degree. He said it's a father's duty to pay for a son's education, so all right, my father had to pay up a little, although I was on local government scholarship as well. I attended lectures by Maya Fortis himself, Jack Goody, Edmund Leech, and several other people, very diverse. And in those days the lectures, they were just lectures, they weren't linked to particular exams. The exams were based on questions that the various lecturers had suggested, but there was this very dialectical relationship between what was taught in lectures, what was taught in exams. Now, Edmund Leech's influence is pretty clear, I think, in some of my work, and in fact I have a whole chapter in my recent book on the correspondence I had with him in the field, so that's new light on his own ideas. But I think it would be fair to say that Jack Goody, although he never supervised me, in some sense had a very strong influence too, because he never restricted anthropology to just any one kind of society. His courses included West Africa, European, peasants throughout the world, and so on. And I got a very with a very strong historical
Mm.
sense about it, and I
Yeah.
think that's an influence that also has stuck with me.
Yeah, I mean,
since.
he tries to go, like, say, with his work on writing, the influence
Yeah,
of writing, you know, it's very kind of global.
And I actually attended the original, wasn't a conference, it was a series of seminars that led to that book that he edited. Yeah, that was interesting too.
Yeah, that was good. And Leech in '64 came out with this book on where he talks about kind of identities in northern Burma and the fluidity and things like that.
That was originally in the 50s, late 50s. It's based on his PhD thesis on the Kachins, which he basically had to write partly from memory, having lost his field notes in the war, and partly from historical documents.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, he has written on this. He always regarded that as his best book. What's it called? Political Systems of Highland Burma, where, and this is where the persistent influence from him on the kind of work I do, he tried to show, and I think successfully showed, that what goes on within any one so-called society or culture is very largely a response to what's going on in the neighbouring cultures and societies. So it was very much opposed to the sort of approach that some anthropologists took then, and a small number still do, of treating cultures and societies as isolates of some kind. And I think that was a very strong influence on me, and my later work, especially on patterns of social organization in this part of the world, has been very explicitly on showing various patterns of social organization to be very largely abreactions, dissimulations, as I sometimes call it, from what neighboring populations are doing in order to create an advantageous special niche for each of these populations.
But sometimes even when you're trying to be different, they end up very similar. Like I worked in northern Burma with the Rawang people, and it's really hard to tease apart what's Jingpo, you know, the larger Kachin group, and what's Rawang, because there's so much overlap. I think the languages at least have very different origins. They're not, but over so many years of contact, the culture and the religion, the original religion, and even now the Christianity is pretty much the same. And then the language is just so loaded with loan words and loan structures that it's for a long time we thought they were closely related, and only after doing a lot more work did I realize that was actually related to languages to the north rather than to Kachin itself, or Jingpo. Kachin is actually an ethnic group, and Jingpo is the language of the dominant group there.
Right.
But
of course, Leech, at least two elements in Leech's approach were, first of all, the presence of nearby state formations, which were Chin, Thai-speaking Chins, but also that many of the Kachin or Jingpo communities were situated on ancient trade routes between China and India. So these are the kinds of issues too that I claim to have found to have been influencing the sorts of variations we find in the Malay world.
It's still going on.
Yeah, it's still going on, yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
And the modern nation state is yet a further problem in this respect, of course.
Right, but not in the sense of this Zomia or anything like that.
Well, it's how could I put it? The pre-modern states, in my view, led to this differentiation between what you might call tribal populations, who deliberately kept themselves apart, while, as you just mentioned, still absorbing many elements from other cultures, and the peasants who are part of the state. The modern nation state, of course, tries to wipe away any sense of tribality, wants to make everyone who's outside the cities into some sort of rural proletarian. So there's a much more sociological kind of issues there, but you have to take account of all of this.
Right.
And I've seen these changes go on over 50 years or more, amongst the Orang Asli in particular.
Yeah, I mean, in that area it's quite interesting because, like you said, there's this trade route to China, and some of the groups like the Wa, and to some extent even the parts of the Rawang, because there are speakers of the same language but different dialects across the border as well, and so it's kind of a fluid thing. They used to move back and forth quite a bit, it's less so now. And then the Wa, that I know, they have a much stronger affinity to China than to Burma. You know, even though they live in Burma, they don't really like at least in the past, when Junta was in control, I don't know how it is now, but they would use Chinese money and Chinese language. We actually spoke Chinese with the Wan who were living in Burma. So there's this, and then among the people in Kachin State, there were, in the past, some of them didn't really have a separate identity, but now they're trying to create identities, but at the same time, it depends on the context. They will, in some contexts, they'll say, yeah, I'm Kachin. In others, they'll say, no, I'm not Kachin, I'm Rawang or I'm whatever. And then in some contexts, they'll say, I'm Burmese. And so, whatever is, I guess, advantageous in a particular context,
right.
they will identify one way or the other, because they're, in a sense, all of these things. It just depends on how you want to look at it.
Well, in the Malay world, there are similar patterns. Some groups actually have no ethnonym for themselves.
Right. Well, the Rawang didn't either. It's a new term,
yeah.
the Dulong.
Yeah.
They're the same people on the other side of the Chinese border. They had no name for themselves, so they just named after the river that they live on. The Dulong River, Drum River, or the New River. The people on the New River are called the New people, and the people that live on that Dulong, they're separated actually into two groups.
The other element is that in the peninsula and in parts of Sumatra, there are ancient trade groups predating modern times, when in the days when ships had to lay up on the west coast or on the other side waiting for the winds to change, a lot of material apparently was transshipped across the peninsula or far upstream in Sumatra, and this is also something that seems to have had very considerable effects on the populations through which this trade passed, whether they became porters or whether they siphoned off goods and so on, and also the influence of other languages. I think in particular Khmer seems to...
Khmer even?
Khmer, it seems some of these traders were Khmer speaking, and although we're still waiting for some better data on how far south Khmer, and indeed Mon, in the narrow sense of Mon, was spoken in what is now southern Thailand, northern Peninsula, Malaysia. But that seems to have had a presence, apart from the fact that the Aslian languages are Mon Khmer or Straisitic in any case.
Right. And so this also, the situation is similar to like what you're talking about, how all the Malay loanwords got into Tagalog.
Well, that's, of course, Malay came in, the language, I separate language from people, and languages, of course, can move without necessarily having people move with them. But Malay came in from the south, maybe 2,000 years ago, with an ultimate origin probably in northwest Borneo. The Aslian languages have been present much longer and must have come in from the north. But there does seem to be some evidence of other Austronesian strata, if you like, than just Malay. Something Austronesian was probably there before Malay came in. What it was is unclear, but there are some fairly archaic Austronesian excuse me, lexicon buried in the Aslian languages, and I've been looking tentatively at this, but I'm not an historical linguist. I have discussed it on occasion with the Austronesian material, people like John Wolfe and Bob Lust, to try and get some grips, get a grip on this, but it's still a rather open question. But I did give one conference presentation on this, not yet published.
But that was assuming very early migration into the
maybe 2,500 years ago, as compared to the 2,000 years or fewer that Malay has been present in the peninsula. And possibly with some kind of relationship to Philippine languages. In fact, when I showed some of this data to the late Paul Benedict many years ago, he got very excited. He said, this proves what he's always said, that there were connections directly across the South China Sea between the Philippines and the mainland as regards Austronesian. Well, that may or may not be the case, and, although archaeologists would accept that there's certainly been some sort of trade connection from at least Cham country and Vietnam across to parts of the Philippines. But whether this evolved the peninsula is another matter, open. It's another question.